You rarely see the danger coming. It doesn't arrive with threats or violence. It arrives as warmth, a smile that feels safe, a conversation that feels unusually personal, a presence that makes you think, this person understands me. What you don't realize yet is that your mind is being measured. Your trust is being cataloged. Your emotional defenses are being quietly dismantled. This is silent seduction. Cults do not rely on brute force. They operate through an invisible architecture of influence, one built from language, timing, validation, and emotional mirroring. Many of these methods trace back to psychological techniques popularized by Michael Jace, often admired in isolation for their charm, rapport building, and persuasive elegance. But in the hands of cult leaders, these same techniques are repurposed, scaled, and weaponized. They are used to reshape identity, to manufacture belonging, to convert ordinary people into loyal followers, often without them ever realizing when the shift occurred. This book takes you inside that shadowed process. Through narrative case studies, psychological analysis, and cinematic storytelling, you will see how trust is engineered, how dependency is cultivated, and how love bombing becomes a mechanism of control. You will witness how small affirmations accumulate into obedience and how emotional crises are deliberately created to seal loyalty. But this book is not written to frighten you. It is written to give something back: awareness, clarity, autonomy. By the final chapter, you will recognize the patterns, detect the warning signs, and understand how silent seduction works before it works on you. And if this already made you pause, reflect, or feel a quiet sense of recognition, support this work by liking the video, sharing it with someone who might need it, and subscribing to stay with us as we explore the psychology that usually operates in silence. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Lure of Innocence. The first time it happened, she didn't notice the danger. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the chill presses softly against your skin and the world feels quiet, almost safe. She walked into a room filled with strangers, faces she didn't know, voices murmuring in a strange rhythm. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him, smiling, unassuming, completely ordinary. He didn't command attention. He didn't force it. He simply existed in a way that made her feel seen. It's a subtle trick, the kind that leaves no trace until it's too late. The lure of innocence is precisely that. It feels harmless, welcoming, warm. Like a flickering candle in a cold room, it draws you close without warning. And in that closeness, you begin to trust. This is the first act of silent seduction, the moment before the storm. Cults, predators, manipulators, they all understand it. You can't resist something that feels safe. You lean forward unconsciously, drawn by an invisible thread. The psychology is elegant in its cruelty. Before you even realize it, your defenses begin to lower, one careful smile at a time. At its core, the lure of innocence is deceptively simple. Humans are wired to respond to safety. From childhood, we learn to seek warmth, to gravitate toward those who offer comfort, who nod and smile and mirror our fears and desires. A soft gaze, a gentle laugh, a nod that says, "I understand you. These are the building blocks. Alone they seem benign. Together, they form a lattice that can hold your mind hostage." Consider the psychology behind it. A stranger approaches and listens, not superficially, but with the uncanny precision of someone cataloging your vulnerabilities, your stories, your fears, your hidden yearnings. They are all received with a smile that feels like truth. This is not mere charm. This is architecture. It's the blueprint of influence. Each gesture, each word is designed to create a sense of familiarity, of trust, of inevitability. Imagine a young man named Daniel. He was new in town, isolated, searching for connection. One evening, he attended a small social gathering, just another face in a crowded room. But one member of the group, a quiet, unassuming figure, approached him. She listened as he spoke about his struggles, nodded with perfect timing, and smiled just enough to make him feel noticed. By the end of the night, Daniel felt as if he had known her forever. He didn't know then that this simple interaction, so ordinary on the surface, was the opening act of a carefully orchestrated sequence designed to draw him in deeper. The astonishing part, the part that chills, lies in how invisible it all is. No one yells, no one threatens, no one forces you to obey. Instead, they invite you into a world that feels safe, and in doing so, they plant the first seeds of dependence. You think you're choosing to stay, But you're already inside the trap. There's a hidden truth here, one most people never see. Our need for connection can be weaponized. The very qualities that make us human, our empathy, our longing to belong, our willingness to trust, can be twisted into chains. It's a paradox that feels almost cruel in its elegance. The same qualities that bring warmth and love into your life can also make you dangerously vulnerable. Let me speak directly to you, the reader. Think of the last time someone made you feel completely understood. Not superficially, not with forced sympathy, but genuinely, as if they could read the hidden pages of your soul. Did it feel comforting, safe, perhaps even inevitable? Now imagine if that feeling was not random, not accidental, but engineered. You weren't simply seen, you were mapped. Every smile, every nod, every subtle laugh was a step in a silent choreography designed to make you lean in closer, to lower your guard, to trust without questioning. The mini-climax of this stage is as subtle as it is profound. You don't realize it, but your emotional currency has already been spent. You've exchanged a fraction of your autonomy for a glimpse of acceptance. You feel connected, you feel safe. And in that feeling, the manipulator grows stronger. By the time you notice the manipulation, the strings have been woven into your mind so deeply that disentangling yourself feels impossible. And yet, there is a philosophical undercurrent here that cannot be ignored. The lure of innocence is not evil by nature. It is the reflection of a human truth. We are drawn to warmth, to safety, to acceptance. We crave connection. The darkness arises not from the desire itself, but from those who understand it, who exploit it, who use the innocence of trust as the first step toward control. To observe this is to understand a profound truth about the human psyche. The very qualities that make us open to love, friendship, and empathy are also what make us susceptible to manipulation. Awareness is the first defense. Seeing the threads as they are woven, noticing the patterns behind the smiles, recognizing the art behind the warmth. These are the keys to stepping back, to reclaiming your mind before the storm begins. Chapter 2. The Art of Listening. The room was quiet, yet charged with an almost imperceptible tension. A single lamp flickered in the corner, casting long, wavering shadows across the faces of the gathered group. He sat in the farthest chair, leaning slightly forward, his eyes fixed on each person in turn. There was no rush, no overt display of power. Only an intensity that made every word spoken feel like it mattered, like it was the only thing in the world. And that's when she realized he was listening. Truly listening. It was hypnotic, almost sinister. Not the kind of listening that nods politely or waits for a turn to speak, but a listening that penetrates, that dissects your soul while making you feel cherished. This is the first lesson in the dark art of influence. Attention is the most potent form of power. At its essence, the art of listening is deceptively simple. People want to be seen, heard, and understood. Yet when that desire is weaponized, it becomes a lever, a psychological crowbar that pries open your defenses. Cult leaders, predators, and manipulators alike understand this deeply. Michael Jace's subtle magnetic presence wasn't about performing charm. It was about creating the illusion of intimacy, a mirror reflecting the deepest parts of someone's psyche back at them, perfectly polished and inviting. Psychologically, this is fascinating and terrifying. When someone listens to you with undivided attention, your brain releases oxytocin, the chemical of bonding and trust. Your guard lowers, your mind begins to seek connection and validation, and the person who holds this power can guide, mold, and manipulate without force or threat. Every pause, every tilt of the head, every subtle echo of your words is designed to make you feel understood. And as the illusion deepens, your emotional openness grows, leaving you exquisitely vulnerable. Consider Claire, a young woman who had recently joined a small self-help group. At first, the session seemed ordinary, almost therapeutic. One of the leaders, a calm man with a gentle tone, always made time to ask personal questions. He remembered details about her life, echoed her phrases in conversation, and nodded in just the right moments to make her feel validated. Slowly, Claire began to share more than she ever intended. She trusted him. She confided in him. And by the time she noticed a subtle shift in how she thought about herself, her trust had already been quietly redirected, her emotional loyalty quietly seeded. Here is the hidden insight few people recognize. Listening is not a passive act. It is an active architecture of influence. Cult leaders don't just hear. They catalog, map, and mirror. They remember what excites you, what terrifies you, what you long for. Then, like a sculptor with clay, they reflect it back to you, amplified and refined, until the lines between genuine connection and calculated manipulation blur. Another striking truth is that this method thrives on patience. Unlike overt manipulation, there is no rush. There is no immediate coercion. The seduction unfolds slowly, in repeated interactions that feel organic. Each session, each conversation, each seemingly innocuous question is a brushstroke painting a portrait of intimacy and trust. And when the portrait is complete, the individual has already let down their defenses, believing they have chosen it themselves. Now let me speak directly to you, the reader. Think of the people in your life who listen to you. Not superficially, but in a way that makes you feel illuminated. But consider the possibility that this attention is not neutral. That every mirrored gesture, every empathetic nod, might be a carefully calibrated step toward influence. Could you tell the difference? Could anyone? The mini-climax of this chapter is both subtle and shocking. You don't feel the manipulation until it has seeped into the crevices of your mind. You don't realize your emotional loyalty has shifted, that your autonomy has been chipped away one conversation at a time. The very act that felt nurturing, being seen, being heard, becomes the instrument of control, and the realization hits like a cold hand on the spine. The art of listening can be weaponized more effectively than any overt demand. And yet, there's a philosophical reflection here worth considering. To be heard is a fundamental human need. To connect is essential to our survival, our growth, and our joy. Darkness emerges not from listening itself, but from the intent behind it. In the wrong hands, this gift of attention is transformed into a tool of seduction, a silent mechanism that shapes hearts and minds. Awareness is the key. Understanding how intimacy can be mirrored, manipulated, and misused gives you the power to protect yourself, to be seen and understood without losing your autonomy. So, as you walk through your life, as you encounter those who listen with intensity and care, pause and observe. Feel the warmth, yes, but also watch for the invisible strings, the subtle reflections, the patterns beneath the attention. The art of listening is beautiful, human, necessary, but in the hands of the manipulator, it is the quietest and deadliest seduction of all. Chapter 3. The Subtle Validation Trap. The room smelled faintly of sandalwood, curling smoke drifting in lazy spirals toward the cracked ceiling. Shadows shifted across the walls as if listening along with her, hungrily absorbing every word. She sat on the worn carpet, knees pulled close to her chest, feeling the warmth of a circle of strangers. Each voice was soft, measured, almost imperceptible. I understand exactly, you're right about that. At first it seemed comforting, harmless even, like a gentle breeze brushing against skin. But there was something unnerving in the rhythm, a quiet insistence that threaded through every affirmation, subtle as a heartbeat yet insistent as a drum. This is the essence of the subtle validation trap. It is not a command, a threat, or an overt demand. It is a slow, invisible seduction, a whisper that says, "You are seen, you are understood, you are right." And in hearing it again and again, the mind begins to bend. The will softens and loyalty seeps in without notice. Validation is a human need, simple and universal. From birth, we crave recognition, the assurance that our thoughts, feelings, and choices matter. The danger arises when someone weaponizes this need, feeding it with precision, timing each nod, each word, each smile to create invisible scaffolding around your trust. Cult leaders, manipulators, even skilled actors like Michael Jace understand that to manipulate the mind, one must first mirror the heart. Psychologically, the trap works in near silence. Each small affirmation releases tiny pulses of dopamine, a chemical reward that signals safety, connection, and approval. Over time, the brain starts craving these affirmations like sustenance. You begin to adjust your behavior to earn them, unconsciously molding yourself to fit the patterns of recognition. Each "I see exactly what you mean" is not mere kindness. It is a tiny lever, nudging your emotional alignment, carving channels in your mind that lead inexorably toward attachment and dependence. Take the case of Rebecca, a recent college graduate who had moved to a new city in search of community. At first, the group she joined was simply polite, warm, but one member, a calm, deliberate presence, consistently acknowledged her thoughts with subtle nods, mirrored her phrases, and offered gentle agreement. "You're absolutely right," he would say. "That makes perfect sense." Weeks passed, and Rebecca began to feel seen in ways she hadn't in years. Her trust grew silently, almost naturally. By the time she realized that her opinions, priorities, and even moods were being gently steered to align with the group, it was too late. Her emotional loyalty had been quietly claimed. What is rarely understood is how consistent and tiny these affirmations are. They do not need to be dramatic. Grand gestures are unnecessary. Small, steady doses are far more powerful. A single compliment, repeated in the right rhythm, acts like a metronome for the mind, syncing your thoughts and emotions with the manipulator's subtle intentions. The effect is cumulative, imperceptible until your mental scaffolding has been fully erected. The web is invisible until it is impossible to step outside. Now, let me speak directly to you, the reader. Think of those moments when someone seems to understand you completely, mirroring your thoughts and feelings, nodding at just the right moment. Perhaps you felt a rush of warmth, relief, or connection. Consider the possibility that this warmth, comforting as it is, might not be accidental. Imagine that every word of agreement, every mirrored gesture is not neutral, but part of a deliberate rhythm designed to pull you closer, shape your loyalty, and lower your defenses. Could you recognize it if it were happening to you right now? Most cannot. The mini-climax of this chapter is subtle but striking. You do not feel trapped, you feel cherished. You do not feel manipulated, you feel understood. By the time deeper forms of control are introduced, you are already invested emotionally, your will softened by 100 tiny affirmations that feel entirely natural. You have handed over trust without a struggle, because you believed it was freely given. And the most sinister part? You still feel safe, still feel correct, still feel loved, blissfully unaware that the warmth has become a cage. There is a dark poetry to this process. The manipulator does not shout, does not strike, does not demand. They listen, they nod, they echo, and they affirm. In doing so, they create the illusion of intimacy, of trust, of shared understanding. And in that illusion, they build chains invisible to the eye. Philosophically, this chapter offers a grim reflection on human nature. Our need to be understood is essential, yet fragile. The very qualities that allow us to form deep connections, empathy, recognition, responsiveness, are also the channels through which manipulation enters. Awareness, reflection, and the ability to notice the rhythm behind the kindness are the only shields. Understanding that not every ICU is neutral, that warmth can be engineered, is the first step in reclaiming autonomy and walking freely once again. Chapter 4. Love Bombing 2.0. The night was heavy, thick with humidity that clung to the skin like a second, sticky layer. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting trembling shadows across cracked sidewalks. She walked into the small apartment, expecting solitude, only to be met by a sudden flood of attention. A warmth so sudden, so intense. It knocked the breath from her chest. Compliments rained down like fireflies in the dark. "You're extraordinary. I've never met anyone like you. You're perfect just as you are." At first it felt intoxicating, like walking into a sunbeam after a lifetime in the cold. But the sweetness was a mask, hiding a precision as deliberate as it was dangerous. This is love bombing 2.0, the dark evolution of emotional manipulation. Unlike the subtle validations we explored in the previous chapter, this is a full assault on the senses, a deliberate flooding of attention, affection, and praise designed to overwhelm the mind. It feels like love, but it is a weapon. It is not random adoration. It is strategy, and it is astonishingly effective. At its core, Love Bombing 2.0 exploits one of the most vulnerable aspects of the human psyche, the desire to be wanted, to be adored, to feel exceptional. When someone drowns you in praise, it creates an emotional high, a surge of euphoria that overrides skepticism, reason, and self-protection. The mind begins to associate the source of that praise with safety, belonging, and value. Before you realize it, loyalty is no longer a choice. It is a reflex, a craving as primal as hunger. Psychologically, the mechanism is relentless. Emotional extremes, exuberant praise, intense attention, sudden affection trigger powerful neurochemical responses. Dopamine floods the brain, creating pleasure, excitement, and attachment. Oxytocin binds you to the source, fostering a sense of trust and intimacy that feels immediate, organic, and unassailable. The manipulation is almost surgical. By alternating emotional highs with subtle uncertainties or delays, the manipulator keeps you craving, seeking, and ultimately dependent. Consider the story of Michael, a 27-year-old graphic designer who had recently moved to a new city. He met a woman at a small social gathering. Her presence gentle but electric, every word carefully chosen to flatter and elevate him. Within days, he received texts at all hours, praising his creativity, affirming his intelligence, and reminding him how rare and extraordinary he was. The intensity was dizzying, exhilarating, and slightly disorienting. Michael felt seen, cherished, and exceptional, but unbeknownst to him, each compliment was a carefully calibrated step toward dependency. By the end of the month, he craved her attention like a drug, and the small autonomy he had once taken for granted had begun to erode. The hidden insight here is that love, when weaponized, is indistinguishable from genuine care, at least at first. The human mind is ill-equipped to resist affection that feels abundant, immediate, and personalized. Unlike coercion or fear, love bombing 2.0 does not push you away. It pulls you in. It makes resistance seem unnatural. You question your doubts, believing that anyone who adores you so completely must be trustworthy. The manipulation is quiet yet profoundly effective, because it feels like joy, connection, and human warmth, the very things we seek most desperately. Now let me speak directly to you, the reader. Reflect on the moments when someone has showered you with attention, praise, or affection, making you feel as though you had always been the center of their world. Remember how it felt intoxicating, overwhelming, impossible to resist. Imagine if that intensity was not accidental, not spontaneous, but meticulously designed to create reliance on another's approval. Could you distinguish the genuine from the engineered? Could anyone? That is the terrifying power of love, bombing 2.0. It transforms desire into submission without the need for threats, guilt, or confrontation. The mini-climax of this chapter is subtle, yet emotionally seismic. You don't notice the shift until it has already happened. The emotional flood creates a dependency so rapid and so deep that when the attention wanes, momentarily, strategically, you panic. You seek it again. You crave it. You adjust, bend, and compromise without realizing that your choices are no longer entirely your own. The very source of delight, the praise, the affection, becomes the tether that binds your autonomy to another's will. You are addicted to the warmth that once felt liberating. There is a dark beauty in its simplicity. The manipulator does not need coercion or intimidation. They harness the mind's craving for connection, attachment, and validation, amplifying it to a fever pitch until it becomes a tool of control. What feels like love, intimacy, and joy is in truth the architecture of dependency, engineered, precise, and devastatingly effective. Philosophically, Love Bombing 2.0 exposes a paradox at the heart of human nature. We seek love and admiration because it nourishes the soul, yet those same desires, when exploited, can become the channels through which control enters, bending our will and reshaping our emotional reality. The lesson is not to avoid love or praise, but to understand its power, to remain aware of patterns, rhythms, and intensity, and to recognize that not every warmth is benign. True connection requires reflection, context, and the freedom to step back without guilt or fear. Awareness is the only safeguard against the intoxicating storm of engineered affection. Chapter 5. Information Control. Rain tapped against the window pane in irregular, urgent rhythms, a metronome for the tension that hung thick in the room. He sat at the edge of the circle, watching as others whispered to one another, their voices hushed yet urgent, as though the very walls were listening. Every glance, every casual remark had been curated for impact, filtered for effect. Nothing was random. Every story, every piece of information that reached their ears was meticulously selected. He felt a creeping unease, a suspicion that someone else was writing the narrative of his own reality. And the truth was that he was right. This is the essence of information control. It is not about overt commands or threats. It is the quiet, almost invisible shaping of perception. Cults and manipulative organizations understand that the mind can be steered without a single word of coercion. if you simply control what it consumes. They filter experiences, censor dialogue, and frame every story so that the reality you see is exactly the reality they want you to believe. At its core, information control exploits a basic human truth. We trust what we perceive. Our brains are wired to accept sensory input as fact unless there is strong evidence to the contrary. By curating information, what you read, who you speak to, which perspectives are allowed, manipulators quietly construct an alternate world, one in which doubt, contradiction, or resistance never seems logical. They don't need to shout or command. They merely narrow the field of vision until only their version of reality remains. Psychologically, this is devastating. Human cognition relies on comparison, context, and contradiction to form accurate judgments. When exposure is filtered, when narratives are rehearsed and repetition enforced, your ability to critically evaluate is eroded. Facts become malleable. Memories begin to align with the selective storytelling you consume. Your mind doesn't rebel, it adapts. You feel safe, informed, even enlightened. But it is a carefully orchestrated illusion. Consider Jessica, a young professional who had joined a self-improvement community online. At first, it seemed harmless: group chats, curated articles, motivational posts. But over time, she noticed that certain topics were subtly discouraged. Others were amplified, and dissenting voices disappeared almost instantly. Every news article, every anecdote, every seminar she attended reinforced a singular worldview. By the end of 3 months, Jessica's perception of reality, what was important, true, or dangerous, had been reshaped entirely by the selective information she had been fed. Here lies the hidden truth few recognize. Controlling information is not about lying, it is about framing. Omissions are just as powerful as fabrications. A single absent perspective, a single story untold, can distort reality in ways that overwhelm the intellect. The human mind, craving coherence, fills in gaps, often accepting the narrative offered as absolute truth. The manipulator understands this and leverages it with precision, creating a reality that feels complete, logical, and inevitable, yet is entirely constructed. Now, consider your own life, the information you consume, the stories you trust, the narratives that shape your understanding of the world. Think of how social media, news outlets, even personal relationships selectively highlight, emphasize, and silence. The truth may not be absent, but context is carefully managed. Imagine the subtle ways a skilled manipulator could curate every word, every experience you encounter, nudging your perception until your sense of reality aligns with theirs. Could you recognize it? Could you resist it? Most cannot. The mini-climax of information control is chilling in its subtlety. You do not feel imprisoned, you feel informed, empowered, connected. You do not notice the narrowing of your worldview until you attempt to step outside it. And suddenly, the world feels alien, chaotic, even dangerous. The invisible walls have been built not of bricks, but of filtered stories, silenced contradictions, and repeated narratives. By the time you realize you are inside the trap, your sense of certainty and loyalty has already been cultivated. You do not resist because you believe resistance is illogical. There is a dark elegance to this method. No one is forced to believe. No one is threatened into obedience. The manipulation is clean, precise, and terrifyingly effective. By curating information, controlling access, and selectively repeating messages, the manipulator shapes not only behavior but perception itself. They craft reality, and the victims step willingly into it, mistaking the cage for clarity. Philosophically, this chapter reveals a disturbing truth about human cognition. Our understanding of reality is fragile, dependent not only on sensory input, but on the integrity and breadth of information we receive. When that input is filtered, framed, and controlled, our minds can be subtly, profoundly redirected. Awareness, curiosity, and skepticism are the only safeguards. Recognizing that reality can be curated and understanding who controls the narrative is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy, ensuring that the world you perceive is not an artifice designed by another's hand. Chapter 6. Repetition and Reinforcement. The candlelight flickered across the walls, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to lean closer, listening. In the stillness, a single voice repeated the same phrase over and over, soft, deliberate, hypnotic. You belong. You are one of us. You are safe with us. The words were familiar now, echoing in the minds of those seated around the circle. At first it was almost soothing, a lullaby promising comfort and clarity. But as the minutes stretched into hours and unsettling awareness grew, these words were no longer just sounds. They were shaping reality, bending thought, sewing themselves into the very fabric of belief. This is the power of repetition and reinforcement, the subtle, relentless layering of ideas until they are accepted as truth. In the architecture of control, repetition is the foundation. Core messages, values, and narratives are not merely suggested. They are imprinted, drilled, and internalized through careful, continuous reinforcement. The mind, exposed to repeated patterns of thought, begins to accept them as reality, not because of reason, but because familiarity breeds certainty. At its essence, this is simple yet terrifying. The human brain is wired to recognize patterns, to trust consistency. When a phrase, an idea, or a belief is repeated enough, skepticism fades. Repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity produces comfort. In the context of manipulation, comfort becomes a cage. The repeated message does not need to be true, logical, or ethical. It only needs to be persistent. Over time, repeated messaging reshapes perception, aligns identity with ideology, and quietly erodes autonomy. Consider the story of Daniel, a young man who joined a self-improvement seminar that promised purpose and belonging. At first, he noticed the repetition subtly, key phrases woven into every speech, every newsletter, every group session. Only here can you find the truth. The outside world cannot understand you. At first, they were harmless slogans, easy to dismiss. But week after week, session after session, the phrases became mental echoes. Daniel caught himself thinking them unbidden, repeating them in private, questioning whether the world outside could possibly offer more. By the end of 2 months, the repetition had shaped his perception so thoroughly that alternative viewpoints felt alien, even threatening. His beliefs were no longer his own. They were the product of a carefully orchestrated rhythm of reinforcement. Psychologically, this works through a combination of cognitive and emotional mechanisms. The principle is deceptively simple. Repetition lowers resistance. When ideas are repeated in multiple forms, spoken, written, experienced, they bypass rational scrutiny and embed themselves in memory. Repetition also interacts with emotion. By pairing key messages with feelings of safety, belonging, or reward, the manipulator ensures that these beliefs are not only remembered, but emotionally anchored. Over time, the repetition becomes self-reinforcing. The mind recalls the idea, feels comforted, and seeks further affirmation, creating a feedback loop of internalized control. Here is a hidden truth that is often overlooked. The effectiveness of repetition lies not just in frequency, but in subtle variation. The message may remain the same, but its context, tone, or delivery shifts slightly each time, keeping the mind engaged while still embedding the idea. This technique prevents awareness of manipulation while deepening influence. The brain begins to feel certainty in the idea, even as it believes it has arrived at that certainty independently. Now, let me speak directly to you, the reader. Think about the phrases you have heard most often in your life. Whether from parents, teachers, friends, media, or authority figures, which ones shaped how you see yourself? Which ones guided your choices, quietly aligning your thoughts and beliefs with someone else's design? Repetition is not neutral. It is a tool of influence, capable of steering behavior, perception, and even identity. The question is whether you recognize when it is being used to serve another's agenda, and whether you have the awareness to resist its subtle pull. The mini-climax of this chapter comes not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, unsettling realization. You do not feel coerced, threatened, or forced. You feel certainty, comfort, and alignment. And yet, you realize that much of what you think, much of what you accept as truth, has been carefully curated, repeated, and reinforced to lead you here. Your mind has been guided by invisible hands, shaping your beliefs without your conscious consent. By the time you recognize it, the influence is already internalized. The repetition has worked its quiet magic. There is a sinister elegance to this method. No dramatic gestures, no overt domination, just the steady hypnotic cadence of repetition. Like water slowly carving stone, repeated messages wear down resistance, shaping thought and behavior over time. What feels like self-realization is often the product of a meticulously designed rhythm of influence, a symphony of persuasion that makes surrender feel natural, even inevitable. Philosophically, repetition and reinforcement reveal the profound fragility of human perception. Our minds seek consistency, pattern, and familiarity, yet these very needs can be exploited. Awareness of repetition, the recognition of rhythm, pattern, and persistent messaging, is the key to safeguarding autonomy. To understand that not every familiar phrase, every repeated idea is neutral is to reclaim the ability to think, question, and decide freely. The rhythm of influence is powerful, but the conscious mind can learn to hear it and choose its own path through the echoing shadows. Chapter 7. Manufactured Crises. The wind howled through the narrow alleyways, rattling shutters and sending a chill that crawled beneath the skin. Inside the dimly lit room, candles flickered as whispers spread like wildfire. If we don't act now, it will be too late. The outside world is closing in. The fear was palpable, electric, a shared pulse that gripped every heart in the circle. Yet the threat was illusionary, carefully designed to seem urgent, immediate, and impossible to ignore. The crisis was real in their minds, but entirely manufactured. This is the dark art of the manufactured crisis. It is not chaos born of circumstance, but chaos engineered to create dependency. Cult leaders, manipulators, and even those echoing Michael Jace's psychological strategies understand a fundamental truth. Urgency heightens obedience when fear, threat, or extreme pressure is introduced. Critical thinking falters. Emotions surge, adrenaline spikes, and the mind instinctively seeks solutions that only the manipulator can provide. At its core, the manufactured crisis exploits the human need for safety and certainty. The brain is wired to prioritize immediate threats, to focus on survival. By creating an artificial sense of danger, manipulators hijack this instinct, redirecting attention, loyalty, and action toward themselves. The individual, caught in the emotional storm, does not pause to question the validity of the threat. Logic becomes secondary. Instinct drives behavior, and dependency blooms. Psychologically, this method is devastating. Humans respond to crises with heightened emotional and cognitive arousal. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making, is suppressed under stress, while the amygdala, the emotional center, dominates. In these moments, trust and obedience are far easier to cultivate. By repeatedly presenting manufactured crises, the manipulator ensures that the group turns to them for guidance, protection, and reassurance. Fear becomes a tool, urgency a lever, and loyalty the inevitable outcome. Consider the story of Elena, a young woman drawn into a spiritual group after a period of personal uncertainty. The leaders painted the world outside as dangerous, unstable, and morally corrupt. They told her that only through their teachings could she be safe, find purpose, and protect those she loved. When minor events, a canceled appointment, a delayed message from a friend, were reframed as imminent threats, Elena's anxiety soared. She began to rely on the group not just for guidance, but for emotional survival. By the time she recognized the manipulation, her autonomy had already been eroded. She responded reflexively to their alarms, her decisions guided more by fear than reason. Here is the hidden truth. Manufactured crises do not need to be dramatic or catastrophic. They can be subtle, even mundane, as long as they create a sense of urgency and reinforce the manipulator's authority. A suggestion that the outside world is untrustworthy, a hint that an opportunity is fleeting, or a warning that others cannot be relied upon, all can serve as triggers. The mind, conditioned to seek security, begins to prioritize the manipulator as the sole source of safety and direction. Now, imagine yourself in a similar situation. A leader warns of danger, of betrayal, of imminent collapse. The message is urgent, repetitive, emotionally charged. Your instincts tell you to act, to respond, to trust. At the same time, critical reasoning feels muted, rational questioning suppressed by fear. Could you see through the crisis, or would you respond like Elena, driven by emotion rather than reason? The manufactured crisis is effective because it removes choice, replacing it with reflex, reliance, and obedience. The mini-climax of this method is both dramatic and insidious. You do not feel controlled, you feel needed. You do not feel manipulated, you feel responsible. Every panic, every alarm, Every suggestion of imminent catastrophe funnels your attention, energy, and loyalty toward the manipulator. By the time the truth is revealed, that the crisis was contrived, you are already ensnared. Dependency has been cultivated not through coercion alone, but through the orchestrated rhythm of fear and urgency. There is a terrifying elegance in this approach. The manipulator does not need to physically restrain or threaten. They do not need loud commands or overt domination. They create a world in which the individual believes they must turn to the manipulator to survive, to act, to exist. The threat need not be real. The perception of threat is sufficient. In this way, fear itself becomes the most potent form of control. Philosophically, the manufactured crisis exposes a stark vulnerability in human nature. Our survival instincts, while essential, can be exploited. Emotional urgency overrides reason, and in seeking guidance and safety, we may surrender autonomy. Awareness is the key safeguard. Recognizing when fear is engineered, when urgency is artificial, allows us to reclaim perspective, pause, and choose freely. In the shadows of manufactured crises, the mind is both weaponized and deceived. But the conscious observer can step outside, see the strings, and refuse to dance. Chapter 8. Indebtedness and Obligation. The room was heavy with the scent of incense, sweet and suffocating, clinging to every surface like a slow fog. Candles flickered, casting elongated shadows that seemed to lean in, watching. At the center, a small group sat in silence. One by one, each member was asked to share their personal story, their fears, their dreams. The confessions were intimate, raw, heavy with vulnerability. Then came the general question, how can you give back to the group that has given you so much? It was soft, almost tender. But beneath the surface, it was a pivot, a trap. That simple, polite question planted a seed, a sense of indebtedness, of obligation, of unspoken pressure that would quietly shape behavior for weeks, months, even years to come. This is the subtle power of indebtedness and obligation. It is not overt coercion or intimidation. It is a psychological lever, a tool of control that manipulates the moral architecture of the human mind. When you feel you owe someone, whether for kindness, attention, understanding, or inclusion, you become primed to act in ways that satisfy that perceived debt. The manipulator knows this and wields it with precision. Contributions of time, effort, money, or even emotional labor create not freedom, but chains disguised as goodwill. At its essence, this principle is terrifying in its simplicity. Humans are wired for reciprocity. When given, we instinctively seek to give back. When helped, we feel compelled to repay. Manipulators exploit this natural tendency, creating situations in which the individual willingly sacrifices autonomy, energy, and resources to satisfy a perceived moral debt. The obligation feels voluntary, natural, even virtuous, but it is, in truth, a carefully constructed path toward control. Psychologically, the effects are profound. Each act of contribution reinforces loyalty. Each effort deepens emotional attachment. Each sacrifice blurs the line between personal desire and obligation. Over time, the individual's sense of choice diminishes. Actions that once were optional become expected. Voluntary compliance transforms into reflexive submission. The manipulator does not demand. It simply structures situations so that compliance feels necessary, moral, and urgent. Guilt, gratitude, and moral responsibility merge into a potent psychological cocktail, steering thought and behavior with invisible hands. Consider the case of Lewis, a volunteer at a local self-growth collective. At first, the requests were small: help set up chairs, organize materials, assist a newcomer. Each task came with warmth, gratitude, and recognition. But as weeks passed, the requests escalated subtly: hosting events, contributing funds, recruiting friends. Each contribution reinforced a sense of personal investment. Lewis began to see himself as indispensable, responsible for the collective success. The more he gave, the deeper his attachment, until leaving, or even questioning the group, felt like a betrayal both morally and emotionally. By exploiting the natural drive for reciprocity, the manipulator had transformed service into submission. Hidden within this process is a subtle, almost invisible mechanism: the paradox of voluntary enslavement. Because the obligations feel self-chosen, the individual rarely perceives the manipulation. Guilt is internalized. Refusal feels selfish or disloyal. By framing compliance as a moral or ethical responsibility, manipulators bypass resistance. The victim believes they are acting from virtue, when in fact they are responding to a carefully calibrated psychological strategy. Now reflect on your own life. Consider moments when you felt compelled to repay kindness, support, or attention. Moments when refusal seemed impossible or morally wrong. That instinct is natural, adaptive, and socially essential. But imagine if it were exploited, weaponized, and amplified. Imagine a network of influence designed to create incremental cumulative obligations that subtly reshape your choices, your priorities, your identity. Could you recognize the leverage? Could you resist the invisible pull? Most cannot, because the chains are forged from gratitude and moral duty, emotions that feel righteous, noble, and human. The mini-climax of this chapter is a quiet but emotionally charged revelation. The realization that the kindness you accepted, the guidance you followed, and the praise you cherished were not entirely free. Each gift, each compliment, each opportunity carried an invisible ledger, recording debts you were only beginning to recognize. By the time the obligations feel heavy, the sense of dependency is already firmly rooted. Obedience, compliance, and loyalty are no longer optional. They are the natural outcomes of your own generosity, repurposed as control. There is a dark elegance to indebtedness and obligation. It is almost invisible, almost imperceptible, yet devastatingly effective. The manipulator does not demand. They guide. They do not coerce. They cultivate responsibility. The more you give, the more attached you become until your autonomy is not taken. It is willingly surrendered. Every gesture of gratitude, every act of service, every felt duty becomes a thread in the web, pulling you toward a reality you once might have questioned, but now accept without resistance. Philosophically, indebtedness and obligation reveal a tension at the heart of human morality. Our drive to give, to repay, and to act responsibly is both our greatest strength and our most exploitable vulnerability. Awareness of this duality is the first step toward reclaiming agency. Recognizing when moral duty has been weaponized allows the conscious mind to pause, question, and choose freely. The chains may feel heavy, but awareness shines a light that can loosen them, and understanding becomes the first act of liberation. Chapter 9. Identity Fusion. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through the floorboards like an unspoken chant. Faces glowed in the flickering candlelight, eyes fixed on a central figure who spoke with quiet authority. As the words washed over the group, something imperceptible began to happen. The boundary between self and other blurred. One by one, individuals felt their personal thoughts, desires, and doubts dissolve, merging with the collective pulse of the circle. The sensation was intoxicating, almost euphoric, yet beneath the warmth lurked a subtle, terrifying truth. The self, once distinct, was beginning to vanish. This is identity fusion, the psychological phenomenon where an individual's sense of self becomes intertwined, almost inseparable, from the collective identity of a group. In the architecture of control, it is one of the most powerful tools. Once personal boundaries are dissolved, resistance diminishes. Choice is no longer exercised independently. It is filtered through the lens of the group. Loyalty becomes instinctive, obedience feels natural, and dissent becomes inconceivable. At its core, identity fusion is both simple and profound. Humans are inherently social creatures, wired to seek belonging and purpose. When an individual finds a group that validates their fears, hopes, or insecurities, the allure of merging identity can feel irresistible. In a cult context, this merging is deliberately cultivated. Shared rituals, repeated messaging, emotional highs, and manufactured crises all act as binders, cementing the sense that the group's success, ideology, and survival are inseparable from one's own existence. Psychologically, the implications are staggering. When identity is fused with a group, the individual internalizes the group's values, norms, and perceptions as their own. External criticism is no longer threatening. It is a personal attack. Personal desires are subordinated to collective goals. Moral and ethical boundaries shift to align with the group's ideology. The individual is not just influenced, they are rewritten from the inside out, their autonomy quietly eclipsed by the collective consciousness. Consider Naomi, a young woman who joined a spiritual community seeking purpose. At first, she maintained her personal routines, her individual opinions, her independent decisions. But over months of ritual, repetitive teaching, and shared emotional experiences, Naomi began to feel herself dissolving into the group. When she thought, "I want this," it was the group's voice articulating it. When she felt fear or doubt, the collective reassured her, and those feelings became inseparable from the group's identity. By the end of 6 months, Naomi could no longer separate her from them. Every choice, every desire, every thought had been merged, reshaped, and anchored to the collective. She was loyal, not because she had chosen to be, but because her very sense of self had been fused with the organization. Hidden within this process is a subtle paradox. Identity fusion feels liberating even as it is controlling. The individual experiences belonging, purpose, and meaning, emotions that the human mind craves, while simultaneously surrendering autonomy. Resistance is not only difficult, it feels wrong, almost immoral. The manipulator has created a reality in which disobedience is unthinkable, not because of coercion, but because the self has been redefined to align with the collective. Now, consider your own life. Think about moments when you felt so aligned with a cause, a community, or a belief system that personal boundaries faded. Did it feel empowering? Or did you sense a quiet erosion of autonomy? This is the danger of identity fusion. It can begin subtly, even benevolently, before becoming a mechanism of control. Awareness is critical. Recognizing when personal values, thoughts, and desires are being overwritten by collective narratives is the first step toward reclaiming selfhood. The mini-climax of identity fusion is as invisible as it is complete. You do not feel controlled, you feel united. You do not feel dominated, you feel part of something greater, and yet your personal agency has been quietly eroded. The line between your will and the group's will has vanished, leaving loyalty, obedience, and alignment as automatic responses. By the time awareness dawns, the fusion is so deep that disentangling the self from the collective is emotionally painful, psychologically disorienting, and profoundly challenging. There is a dark elegance to this method. It is invisible, nearly imperceptible, and devastatingly effective. No force, no threat, no violence is necessary. Through shared experience, repeated messaging, emotional reinforcement, and strategic crises, the manipulator orchestrates the ultimate surrender, the voluntary dissolution of the self into the group. The individual's autonomy is not stolen. It is replaced by a sense of belonging, a carefully engineered identity that feels natural, inevitable, and righteous. Philosophically, identity fusion illuminates the precarious balance between belonging and autonomy. Humans crave connection, but connection can be weaponized. Awareness, reflection, and the cultivation of personal boundaries are essential defenses. Recognizing when the self is merging with an external ideology, when personal thought is being subsumed, allows the conscious mind to pause, reclaim agency, and assert individuality. Identity, though social and malleable, is precious, and guarding it is the first act of liberation from silent seduction. Chapter 10. Gut Feelings and Red Flags. Rain-slicked streets reflected the dim glow of street lamps, each puddle a tiny mirror of distorted light. A figure stood beneath the overhang of a closed cafe, heart-hammering senses taut. Something was off, though they could not put a finger on it. A casual glance revealed nothing. The streets were empty, the night quiet. But the discomfort lingered, a silent whisper crawling along the spine. That whisper, that flicker of unease, was the mind's first warning. A gut feeling, a subtle red flag signaling that all was not as it seemed. Gut feelings are the mind's early alarm system. They emerge before conscious reasoning, a quiet intuition alerting us to danger long before the logic catches up. In the context of psychological manipulation or cult influence, these signals are crucial. Yet they are often ignored, dismissed as paranoia or overreaction. Cults and the manipulators echoing Michael Jace's techniques rely on this dismissal. By cultivating charm, reassurance, and incremental persuasion, they lull the intuitive mind into silence while slowly advancing control. The principle is simple, but potent. The human brain evolved to detect patterns, threats, and inconsistencies. These signals often manifest as subtle unease, fleeting doubt, or emotional tension. They may appear as a tightening in the chest, a cold shiver, a sudden mental hesitation. Ignoring them is easy. After all, they do not come with clear evidence or rational explanation. But in high-stakes psychological manipulation, ignoring them can be fatal to autonomy. Consider the story of Marco, a software engineer drawn into a life enhancement circle. At first, the interaction seemed benign, warm smiles, supportive language, thoughtful attention. Yet Marco experienced moments of unease, casual dismissals of his concerns, slight inconsistencies in stories, veiled pressure to share personal experiences. He ignored them, rationalizing that he was being overly sensitive. Slowly, these small red flags accumulated, unnoticed until they formed a silent cage. By the time he recognized the manipulative patterns, he had already invested months. His personal boundaries eroded, his sense of judgment clouded. The gut feelings had been there from the start, but he had been trained, subtly, to distrust them. Psychologically, gut feelings operate at a level beyond conscious logic. They are shaped by both instinct and experience, a combination of emotional memory and pattern recognition. Cult leaders exploit this by masking inconsistencies and blending reassurance with subtle pressure. They provide just enough comfort to suppress the alarm, just enough trust to override doubt, while simultaneously layering narratives, obligations, and identity-shaping mechanisms. The individual begins to question their instincts, to seek rationalization, to assume that unease is their fault, not the situation's. Hidden within this dynamic is a chilling truth. The very act of being attuned to your gut feelings can be undermined. Manipulators craft environments where doubt is socially discouraged, intuition is mocked, and questioning becomes morally suspect. They implant the idea that trust should be absolute, that loyalty requires the suppression of instinct, and that questioning authority equates to disloyalty. The result is a silent subversion of internal guidance, a quiet erasure of the mind's earliest, most reliable alarm system. Now, consider your own intuition. Reflect on those fleeting moments when something felt wrong. An offhand comment, a subtle coercion, a tiny inconsistency in demeanor. These moments are more than coincidence. They are red flags, signals from a mind evolved to protect itself. In the architecture of manipulation, attending to these signals is an act of survival. Ignoring them, no matter how charming, persuasive, or compelling the external circumstances, is a surrender of agency. The mini-climax of recognizing gut feelings occurs in the moment of decision. You feel the tension, the prickle of discomfort, the flicker of unease. Will you act? Will you question, step back and observe? Or will you rationalize, dismiss, and continue forward? That split second is decisive. The gut feeling is subtle, almost imperceptible, but it is your earliest and most honest ally in discerning truth from influence. Cults and manipulators do not want you to act on it. They thrive on your hesitation, your rationalization, your self-doubt. There is a paradoxical elegance in this process. The mind's internal warnings are precise, yet manipulators exploit them with surgical subtlety, creating environments where instinct conflicts with social pressure, desire, and emotional bonds. Recognition is the first act of reclaiming control. Each time a red flag is acknowledged, each time a gut feeling is trusted rather than suppressed, the individual strengthens their autonomy, fortifies boundaries, and prepares to resist the silent seduction that surrounds them. Philosophically, gut feelings remind us of a profound truth. Intuition is not mere superstition. It is the brain's early warning system, the subtle pulse of self-preservation. In a world of charm, manipulation, and carefully orchestrated influence, learning to recognize, trust, and act upon these signals is essential. Awareness transforms discomfort into clarity, unease into insight, and hesitation into conscious choice. The shadows may whisper, the candles may flicker, the words may charm, but when your instincts speak, it is your first line of defense. Heed it, and you reclaim the power that manipulation seeks to quietly erase. Chapter 11. Behavioral Shifts in Loved Ones. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, a comfortable domestic haze that normally signaled warmth and safety. But tonight something felt off. The laughter that had once been spontaneous was now measured, rehearsed. A glance across the table revealed subtle tension. A pause too long before answering. A fleeting shadow of irritation. Eyes that darted away when asked a simple question. It was a quiet change, almost imperceptible. Yet the air was heavy with a sense of disconnection, an invisible rift forming where intimacy had once lived. Something was happening beneath the surface, and it was unsettling. Behavioral shifts in loved ones are one of the earliest indicators of psychological manipulation. When someone you trust begins to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly, it is often the product of deliberate influence, whether through social pressure, emotional manipulation, or subtle indoctrination. These shifts may manifest in personality, priorities, habits, or communication patterns, each alteration a small thread in a larger web of control. The changes are rarely dramatic at first. They creep in gradually, making detection difficult and the impact cumulative. At the core, behavioral shifts are about control. Cults and manipulators leverage the human tendency to conform to social cues and emotional pressures. They understand that change is more effective when it appears voluntary, when the individual feels ownership over decisions and attitudes. By creating environments that reward compliance and discourage independent thought, they reshape behavior subtly. Over time, this incremental erosion alters perception, self-concept, and priorities, steering individuals toward alignment with the manipulator's ideology and goals. Psychologically, these shifts are reinforced by several mechanisms. Cognitive dissonance plays a key role. When a loved one begins to adopt new behaviors or beliefs, they experience discomfort if actions contradict their previous identity. To resolve this discomfort, they rationalize and internalize the changes, making them feel authentic and self-directed. Emotional manipulation intensifies this process, often combining praise, subtle criticism, and conditional acceptance to guide choices. Social isolation and selective exposure further accelerate change, removing alternative perspectives and reinforcing conformity. Consider the story of a Shia, whose brother had joined a seemingly benign personal development group. Initially, his changes were minor. He spent more time at meetings, became more secretive about conversations, and seemed unusually defensive when questioned. Over months, his priorities shifted dramatically. Family gatherings became inconvenient, old friendships faded, and he began repeating the group's mantras verbatim. To outsiders, the transformation appeared subtle, almost natural. But to Aya, it was disorienting, even frightening. The person she had known seemed to be vanishing, replaced by a new persona defined by external influence rather than internal choice. Hidden within these behavioral changes are patterns that often go unnoticed. Emotional flatness, exaggerated enthusiasm for group activities, avoidance of dissenting opinions, and increasing intolerance for critical questioning. These signals are subtle because manipulators rely on their invisibility. Abrupt or extreme changes would trigger resistance and scrutiny. By maintaining a veneer of normalcy while incrementally shifting attitudes and actions, they ensure that the process of control remains largely undetected until it is firmly established. Now, turn your attention to your own relationships. Think about moments when someone close has become different, less communicative, more secretive, unusually rigid in beliefs or habits. Did you dismiss it as stress, personality change, or life circumstances? These moments are important. Early recognition is crucial because behavioral shifts are both predictive and cumulative. Each small change may seem insignificant, but over time, they create a foundation upon which deeper psychological control is built. Understanding these early indicators equips you to intervene, question, and protect not only your loved ones, but also your own sense of reality. The mini-climax of this chapter comes in the realization that behavioral shifts are often a silent invasion. The changes feel gradual, benign, even adaptive, but each is a calculated step toward alignment with an external ideology or manipulative influence. By the time the pattern is obvious, the foundation of autonomy may have already been compromised. Awareness at this stage is both a warning and a lifeline. Noticing subtle changes before they solidify provides the chance to act, to question, and to reestablish personal and relational boundaries. There is a dark, almost surgical elegance to this form of influence. Manipulators do not need overt confrontation or coercion. They orchestrate small, incremental shifts that seem natural, that feel internally motivated, Each behavioral alteration is reinforced, rewarded, and normalized until it becomes part of the individual's identity. The process is invisible to most observers and disorienting for those who love the individual most. But knowledge is power. By understanding the signs, patterns, and underlying mechanisms, we can pierce the veil of subtle influence and recognize the silent seduction at work. Philosophically, behavioral shifts in loved ones force us to confront a harsh reality. The people we trust can be quietly changed by forces they themselves may not recognize. Awareness, attention, and emotional vigilance are not acts of paranoia. They are essential tools for preserving autonomy, protecting relationships, and maintaining clarity of perception. Observing, questioning, and gently probing behavioral shifts allows us to reclaim influence, not through force, but through conscious understanding. In a world of subtle manipulation, the eyes and mind are the first line of defense, and noticing what is unseen can make the difference between control and freedom. Chapter 12. Seeking External Perspectives. The room was silent except for the low ticking of an old wall clock. Shadows pooled in the corners, thick and waiting, as if the darkness itself were watching. Mara sat on the edge of her bed, phone trembling slightly in her hand. On the screen were names she had not called in months, friends, family voices, from outside the circle of influence that had quietly taken hold of her life. Every fiber of her being screamed hesitation. The group had taught her that outsiders could not understand, that external opinions were dangerous, that loyalty required silence, and yet that whisper, the same one that had nudged her toward questioning before, urged her forward. She took a deep breath and dialed. The act was simple, almost mundane, yet it felt like stepping through a veil into sunlight after years in shadow. Seeking external perspectives is a deceptively simple but profoundly powerful step in reclaiming autonomy from manipulation. When an individual is enmeshed in a group or under subtle influence, perception becomes skewed, beliefs are reinforced, and reality is filtered through layers of crafted narrative. Outsiders, trusted friends, family, professionals, offer a lens unclouded by the group's emotional manipulation, rituals, or ideology. They provide objective feedback, reality checks, and perspectives that are critical for recognizing influence that has already taken root. At its core, this step is about breaking isolation. Cults and manipulative systems deliberately isolate members, not just physically, but emotionally and cognitively. By creating an echo chamber, they ensure that the only voice heard is the one guiding thought and behavior. External perspectives act as mirrors, reflecting truths that have been obscured, highlighting inconsistencies, and validating feelings that may have been dismissed or rationalized away. Reaching out, then, is not just an act of inquiry. It is an act of rebellion against the silent architecture of control. Psychologically, seeking outside input interrupts cognitive entrenchment. When a person is enmeshed in repeated messaging, emotional manipulation, or identity fusion, their internal reasoning becomes aligned with the group's worldview. Doubts are suppressed, fears are normalized, and perceptions are carefully guided. External voices provide contrast, triggering critical reflection. They introduce dissonance in a controlled way, prompting the individual to examine beliefs and behaviors against a benchmark of reality. This process can be unsettling because it forces confrontation with truths that may have been systematically hidden or reinterpreted. Consider Daniel, who had spent nearly 2 years in a self-improvement group that slowly consumed his daily life. Friends noticed subtle shifts. He became evasive, defensive, and increasingly rigid in his priorities. At first, Daniel resisted their concern, insisting that their perceptions were outdated, that he had changed, evolved, grown. Yet, when a trusted mentor gently challenged his narratives, Daniel felt the first stirrings of clarity. Hearing the same observations repeated by someone outside the group, the patterns, the manipulations, the inconsistencies, shattered the veil just enough for him to recognize the subtle control that had taken hold. External perspectives had not forced change, but they had cracked the mirror of isolation, giving Daniel the room to think independently again. The hidden truth is that external perspectives must be chosen carefully. Not all voices outside the group are helpful, and some may be dismissive or judgmental in ways that reinforce defensiveness. The goal is not confrontation, but illumination. Look for individuals who can offer empathy, insight, and honesty. Those who will reflect reality without judgment, providing the mental and emotional space to question, observe, and reclaim agency. Their perspective acts as a compass, pointing toward the authentic self, away from the fog of influence. Now turn your attention inward. Who in your life can provide an untainted perspective? Who will listen without pressure, without hidden agenda, and offer reflections that cut through the haze of manipulation? Reaching out is not a sign of weakness. It is an act of courage. It is the recognition that no matter how persuasive, how compelling, or how enveloping the influence may be, there exists a reality outside its grasp, and it is worth seeing, hearing, and trusting. The mini-climax of this process is both subtle and powerful. You extend a hand, make the call, or speak the difficult words. You hear truths you may not want to hear, confront inconsistencies, and feel the fragile thrill of mental liberation. It is a moment of awakening, of realization, of reclaiming space within your own mind. The darkness that had felt impenetrable, the isolation, the subtle pressure, the quiet seduction, now has cracks. Light filters through unevenly but unmistakably, illuminating possibilities that were previously obscured. There is a delicate power in seeking external perspectives. It is neither a panacea nor a guarantee, but it is a necessary step in untangling influence. By combining observation, intuition, and trusted insight, the individual begins to differentiate between what has been implanted and what is authentically their own. It strengthens autonomy, reinforces personal boundaries, and nurtures clarity of thought, tools that are essential for navigating the shadows of manipulation. Philosophically, this chapter reminds us that human perception is never isolated, never infallible. We are social creatures, and perspective is both a gift and a shield. When influence surrounds us, seeking insight beyond immediate confines is not optional, it is essential. It is through dialogue, reflection, the courage to hear truths uncomfortable or dissonant that we reclaim agency, preserve identity, and confront the silent seduction that seeks to rewrite our minds. Step outside the circle, listen, and allow reality to guide you. Only then can the shadows be pierced and freedom begin to take shape. Chapter 13. The Road to Reclamation. A cold wind rattled the windows of the abandoned warehouse, scattering fragments of paper across the cracked concrete floor. Inside, Emma stood alone, her reflection fractured across shards of broken glass. For years, the invisible threads of influence had wrapped around her mind. Gentle, imperceptible, but unyielding. Each thread had manipulated, shaped, and reshaped her thoughts until autonomy seemed distant, like a memory from another life. And yet, as she stared at her fragmented reflection, she realized something essential. The threads could be cut. The power to reclaim herself had always been hers. It was buried beneath layers of manipulation, waiting for courage to dig it free. Reclamation begins with awareness. Recognizing that one's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors have been subtly influenced is the first and most essential step. Without acknowledgement, the architecture of manipulation remains invisible, its foundations unchallenged. Awareness is the flashlight in the dark corridors of the mind. It illuminates the hidden mechanisms, the subtle cues, and the silent pressures that have guided decisions for months or even years. Only when these forces are visible can they be dismantled. The core idea is deceptively simple. Reclaiming autonomy requires deliberate, incremental acts of critical thinking, observation, and self-reflection. Manipulators rely on routine, repetition, and isolation to control perception. To break free, one must reverse the process. Step 1. Question assumptions. Every belief, every internalized message, every instinct that feels manipulated must be examined. Ask, whose voice is this? Is this truly my choice, or has it been implanted? Questioning is not rebellion against self, but reclamation of self. It is the first assertion of mental sovereignty. Psychologically, this process engages both cognitive restructuring and emotional recalibration. Long-term influence reshapes neural pathways. Repetition ingrains thought patterns, emotional extremes create bonds, and identity fusion blurs the boundaries between self and external ideology. Reclamation requires intentional effort to form new pathways, to reinforce independent reasoning, and to restore personal values. Techniques include journaling to externalize thought patterns, reflective meditation to observe emotional responses, and controlled exposure to outside perspectives to reestablish a realistic view of the world. Each act, no matter how small, strengthens the mind's independence and resilience. Consider the story of Lucas, who had been deeply involved in a charismatic spiritual community. Over time, he found his own beliefs, career ambitions, and relationships quietly eroded. The turning point came when he began keeping a daily journal, recording not just events, but his thoughts, feelings, and doubts. At first, the pages were chaotic, filled with confusion and contradiction. But over weeks, a pattern emerged. External influence could be distinguished from genuine thought. With this awareness, Lucas began to reclaim decision-making authority. He sought conversations with trusted friends outside the group, reflected critically on the organization's narratives, and gradually reconnected with passions and pursuits he had abandoned. The reclamation was not instant, but each deliberate act peeled away the layers of influence, restoring autonomy, clarity, and self-trust. A hidden insight in this journey is the necessity of patience. Manipulation does not dissolve overnight. The mind resists sudden change, even when the truth is known. Fear, guilt, and residual loyalty can linger like shadows in a sunlit room. Reclamation requires persistence, incremental victories, and a willingness to confront discomfort. Each act of self-determination, choosing what to read, deciding whom to trust, asserting personal boundaries, is a brick in the foundation of freedom. Success is measured not in dramatic gestures, but in sustained, mindful reclamation of thought, behavior, and identity. Now, consider your own mind. Think of the subtle threads of influence that may have woven themselves into your beliefs, decisions, or relationships. Reclaiming autonomy is not about shame or blame. It is about restoration. Begin with observation. Notice thought patterns, emotional triggers, and external pressures. Then engage critical reflection. Question the origins of beliefs, test assumptions, and seek perspectives outside the sphere of influence. Finally, take action. Set boundaries, reconnect with authentic desires, and allow yourself to feel fully without fear of judgment or control. Each step is an assertion of self, a reclaiming of power, a return to the agency that is your birthright. The mini-climax of this chapter comes in the act of conscious choice. Emma steps away from the shards of glass, feeling the cold concrete under her feet, sensing the wind's pull, noticing the sound of her own breath. Each decision, small or large, is hers alone. The threads that once bound her are still present, but their grip has weakened. She has become aware, reflective, and deliberate. The liberation is quiet, almost imperceptible but profound. Reclamation is a process, a journey of returning to oneself, a defiance of the silent seduction that sought to erase individuality. Philosophically, the road to reclamation reminds us that autonomy is not a static state. It is a continuous practice, a daily assertion against influence, manipulation, and control. Freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the active cultivation of clarity, self-awareness, and deliberate choice. In a world where unseen forces seek to shape thought, the courageous act is to observe, question, and reclaim. The mind, once liberated, becomes a sanctuary. A place where truth is discerned, intuition is trusted, and the self in all its complexity is honored. Reclamation is not an end. It is a lifelong affirmation of agency, resilience, and the indomitable power to choose one's own path. Chapter 14. The Legacy of Silent Seduction. The candle flickered, casting long, restless shadows across the peeling walls of the old apartment. In the corner, Jonas sat with his hands clasped, staring at the floor as if it could reveal the answers he sought. Years had passed since the invisible grip of manipulation first tightened around his mind, yet the residue remained. Memories of whispered promises, subtle validations, and orchestrated crises lingered like ghosts in the corners of his consciousness. The air felt heavy, charged with the echo of choices he had thought were his own. Even now he felt the faint pulse of the unseen threads, a quiet reminder that influence, once sown, leaves a mark far deeper than the present moment. The legacy of silent seduction is both profound and insidious. It does not merely shape behavior temporarily. It alters the architecture of identity, trust, and perception. Those who have experienced it may find themselves questioning not just the world around them, but the very essence of who they are. What is real? What is authentic? Which thoughts were born from the self, and which were implanted, coaxed or cultivated by subtle manipulation. The consequences are subtle yet enduring, like cracks in a mirror that distort reflections long after the surface appears intact. At the core, the long-term impact is psychological conditioning. The mind, once exposed to repeated emotional extremes, targeted affirmations, and carefully curated narratives, develops patterns that can persist even after the manipulative influence is removed. Trust becomes fragile, vigilance becomes instinctual, and certainty becomes elusive. Survivors may oscillate between hyper-awareness and confusion, struggling to distinguish between genuine relationships and echoes of previous manipulation. Recovery is not instantaneous. It is a journey that demands patience, reflection, and self-compassion. Psychologically, this legacy manifests through several mechanisms. First, identity dissonance. The individual may feel a persistent tug-of-war between their authentic self and the self shaped under influence. Second, relational skepticism. After being manipulated, it is natural to question motives even in sincere interactions. Third, cognitive hypervigilance. Subtle cues that would have gone unnoticed before now trigger heightened sensitivity to potential manipulation. These mechanisms, while protective, also carry emotional weight, often producing anxiety, guilt, or lingering doubt. Consider Lila, who had been part of a charismatic spiritual circle for nearly a decade. The group had disassembled her sense of individuality, slowly rewarding compliance and subtly discouraging independent thought. Years later, even after leaving, she found herself second-guessing her own preferences, questioning her career choices, and mistrusting new friendships. Simple decisions, what to wear, what to eat, how to spend an evening, became exercises in self-doubt. Yet, through therapy, journaling, and conscious reflection, Leela gradually began to recognize patterns, differentiate between past influence and present choice, and reclaim autonomy. The legacy of manipulation was not erased, but it became navigable, a shadow that no longer controlled her every movement. Hidden within this legacy is a surprising truth. While silent seduction leaves scars, it also leaves a blueprint for resilience. Those who have endured subtle manipulation often develop extraordinary emotional intelligence, heightened empathy, and a keen ability to read social dynamics. The same awareness that once made them vulnerable now equips them with insight and intuition. Recognizing the marks left by influence is not a weakness. It is an opportunity to understand the mind's mechanics, protect oneself in the future, and cultivate wisdom that others may never acquire. Now, reflect on your own mind and experiences. The subtle threads of influence, the moments when reality was quietly shifted around you, may have left traces, lingering doubts, questions about trust, or the faint echo of a coerced belief. This is normal. The important step is not to erase the past, but to integrate it, to examine the patterns, and to reclaim agency. Each memory, each insight, each act of conscious choice becomes a building block for a renewed self, one informed by experience rather than dominated by it. The mini-climax of this reflection is the recognition that legacy is not destiny. Jonah, after years of reflection, stood in the dim apartment, feeling the weight of shadows but also the stirring of agency. Awareness was now his tool, choice his ally. The past remained, a teacher, a warning, but it no longer dictated his actions. Each decision was deliberate, each thought scrutinized, each relationship entered with both openness and discernment. The seduction had left its mark? Yes. But it had also revealed the pathways to freedom, resilience, and authentic living. Philosophically, the legacy of silent seduction teaches us that influence is never fleeting. It leaves traces that shape perception, trust, and identity. Yet the human mind is adaptive, capable of observing, learning, and reclaiming agency. Scars from manipulation are not chains. They are maps. They guide us to understand vulnerability, recognize patterns, and nurture autonomy. In the cinematic theater of life, where subtle influences play out unseen, our responsibility is to illuminate the shadows, honor our experiences, and cultivate a self that is both aware and resilient. The past may have whispered control, but the present offers a choice: to live consciously, to trust wisely, and to step forward unbound. Chapter 15. Everyday Manipulation. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow across the office floor. Sam's fingers hovered over the keyboard, a subtle tension tightening in his chest. The weekly team meeting had just ended, and yet the lingering words of his manager replayed in his mind. We all have to pull together, or risk falling behind. It sounded benign, even motivational, but beneath the surface was a subtle pressure, an invisible hand nudging compliance. This was not an isolated incident. Everyday manipulation is the silent sibling of cult techniques. It may not require isolation or love bombing, but it thrives in the ordinary: workplaces, friendships, romantic relationships, and media consumption. The core idea is deceptively simple. Influence can be exerted through subtle, repeated nudges, strategic affirmations, and controlled narratives that shape perception, decisions, and behavior. Just as a sculptor chips away at stone, these techniques mold the mind quietly, imperceptibly over time. Recognizing the architecture of influence in daily life is the first step toward safeguarding autonomy. Psychologically, everyday manipulation exploits the same principles as more extreme indoctrination: repetition, emotional triggers, selective information, and social pressure. The human mind craves coherence and belonging, and these desires can be leveraged to direct decisions subtly. For example, a manager may use praise to shape behavior, complimenting certain work habits while ignoring others, creating a preference for compliance. In relationships, small but consistent validation or withdrawal of it can cultivate dependency and obedience. In media, curated narratives and selective framing guide perception, often without conscious awareness. The mind, seeking meaning and pattern, internalizes these cues, gradually aligning thought and action with the influence source. Consider Mariah, a mid-level marketing executive. Her supervisor's approval was warm and encouraging one moment, then quietly withheld the next. The inconsistency was subtle but deliberate, fostering an anxious attention to her manager's reactions. Over months, Mariah found her own priorities bending to anticipate approval, her ideas shaped by the unspoken expectations of another. She began working longer hours, sacrificing personal boundaries, all while believing these choices were self-motivated. Only after stepping back and observing the pattern did she recognize the manipulation. The praise, the omission, the gentle nudges were a sophisticated orchestration of control, designed not through overt command, but through emotional and cognitive shaping. In another scenario, media manipulation shows similar patterns. News outlets, social media algorithms, and curated content create narratives that influence perception of reality. By repetition, emotional framing, and selective exposure, individuals are subtly guided to adopt beliefs, form judgments, and even modify behavior. The process is nearly invisible. Unlike a cult, there is no single orchestrator, yet the psychological mechanisms, reinforcement, validation, and fear or desire triggers, mirror the same architecture of silent seduction. Recognizing these influences is not paranoia, it is awareness. A hidden insight is that everyday manipulation often masquerades as choice or freedom. The subtle cues encourage actions that appear self-directed, while the underlying guidance shapes thought and decision. The danger lies in invisibility. Influence that feels natural is influence that bypasses critical scrutiny. By identifying these subtle nudges, patterns of praise, social expectation, selective exposure, we reclaim the ability to respond rather than react. Awareness transforms vulnerability into agency. Now, I want you to examine your own life. Reflect on daily interactions, media consumption, and social dynamics. Where do you feel compelled to act, believe, or decide in ways that feel automatic? Ask yourself, whose voice is guiding this choice, and is it aligned with my authentic self? Small realizations compound. Noticing patterns of influence is the first step toward autonomy. Just as you would lock a door to protect your home, you can establish cognitive boundaries to protect your mind. The mini-climax of this awareness comes in the subtle assertion of choice. Sam, after weeks of reflection, paused in a meeting when his manager offered another helpful suggestion. Instead of immediately complying, he asked calmly and deliberately, "What outcome are we aiming for, and how do we measure success?" The simple act of questioning interrupted the unconscious flow of influence. Mariah began tracking her decisions, distinguishing between those internally motivated and those nudged by external pressures. Each small act, a pause, a question, a reflective thought, represents a reclaiming of agency, a refusal to be shaped invisibly. Philosophically, everyday manipulation reminds us that control is rarely loud. It is quiet, consistent, and woven into the rhythms of life. Influence is not inherently evil. It becomes dangerous when unexamined, when the mind surrenders without awareness. By cultivating mindfulness, reflection, and critical thinking, we equip ourselves to navigate this web of subtle control. The legacy of silent seduction need not extend beyond the shadows of awareness. In the everyday, just as in extremes, the mind is a battlefield, and consciousness, vigilance, and deliberate choice are our strongest defenses. Autonomy is won not in grand gestures, but in the persistent, everyday act of observation and discernment. Chapter 16. Facing the Seducer Within. Rain tapped against the windows like a persistent whispered warning. Inside the dim apartment, Mara sat alone, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes searched for the familiar self, the version of her that once made choices without hesitation, that trusted instinctively, that believed in her own judgment. But the image staring back felt fractured, a mosaic of influences, subtle pressures, and long-buried manipulations. Somewhere beneath the surface, the seducer lurked, not a person, but a force inside her own mind, waiting for the right moment to nudge, persuade, and reclaim control. The seducer within is perhaps the most insidious form of influence. Unlike external manipulators, this force knows your desires, fears, and insecurities. It speaks the language of familiarity, echoing your own thoughts, rationalizations, and justifications. Understanding this internal adversary is not an exercise in paranoia. It is an act of courage. To resist manipulation, we must first acknowledge our own vulnerabilities, the patterns of thought and emotion that make us susceptible. It is a confrontation with ourselves, one that can be unsettling, humbling, and profoundly liberating. At its core, the concept is simple but powerful. Manipulation is most effective when it aligns with pre-existing needs or wounds. Loneliness, insecurity, ambition, the desire for approval, these are open doors. The seducer within knows these doors intimately and can guide external influence straight through them. By recognizing these tendencies, by shining a light on the patterns that predispose us to compliance, we reclaim agency. Awareness is the first line of defense. Mindfulness, the shield that allows us to act deliberately rather than react automatically. Psychologically, self-awareness involves mapping the mind's susceptibility. Certain triggers, emotional, social, cognitive, are like pressure points. A compliment, a shared secret, a moment of validation can be harmless in one context, but manipulative in another. Repeated exposure strengthens neural pathways, creating habitual responses that feel natural. The challenge lies in identifying these automatic responses without judgment, observing them with curiosity, and consciously deciding whether to act or resist. In effect, we become both the observer and the participant, navigating our own mind with vigilance and care. Consider Adam, a talented writer who had long struggled with self-doubt. Early in his career, he became involved in a collaborative writers' circle that seemed nurturing, supportive, and full of encouragement. Over time, subtle patterns emerged. Praise was offered selectively. Constructive criticism was cloaked in personal validation, and group approval became a currency for self-worth. Adam's insecurities were weaponized, not by cruelty, but by the mechanics of influence. For years, he chased validation, doubted his own instincts, and deferred decisions to the group's subtle cues. Only when he began journaling, meditating, and questioning his automatic responses did he recognize the seducer within, the part of himself that sought approval above authenticity, that allowed external influence to dictate internal belief. A hidden truth emerges here. The seducer within is not evil. It is human. It is the part of us that seeks safety, belonging, and recognition. And yet, left unchecked, it can undermine autonomy, shaping choices in ways that feel inevitable. The challenge is to cultivate resilience, to engage in deliberate reflection, and to practice self-compassion. Recognizing susceptibility is not a weakness. It is the key to mastering it. By understanding our triggers, our desires, and our fears, we transform vulnerability into insight, and insight into empowerment. Now, look inward. Which parts of your mind are most eager for approval? Where do you feel the pull of external influence disguised as personal desire? Are there repeated patterns? Choices made without awareness, habits formed under subtle guidance that require examination. Facing the seducer within demands honesty, courage, and patience. It is a dialogue with yourself, an investigation into the architecture of your own susceptibility. Every insight, every acknowledgement becomes a step toward autonomy, a reclamation of the self that was always capable of choice. The mini-climax arrives in this confrontation. Mara, after weeks of reflection, paused at a familiar moment of anxiety. An email from a colleague praising her work, yet loaded with subtle expectations. Her first instinct was to respond immediately, to adjust, to comply. But this time she breathed, observed the reaction without judgment, and asked herself, is this my choice, or is it a response to an internalized need for approval? In that instant, she reclaimed a fragment of her autonomy. The seducer within had whispered, nudged, and tempted. But conscious awareness turned the whisper into a decision, deliberate and self-directed. Philosophically, facing the seducer within teaches a universal lesson. Influence begins not just outside, but inside. We are all susceptible, and acknowledging this is not shameful, it is human. True power lies in self-knowledge, in mindfulness, and in the courage to observe one's own mind without fear. In the shadows of manipulation, awareness is illumination. In the quiet struggle with our own tendencies, resilience is forged. The seducer within is not vanquished, but its influence can be transformed. Every act of reflection, every moment of deliberate choice is a declaration of autonomy. The mind, once navigated consciously, becomes not a battleground for control, but a sanctuary of self, capable of both vulnerability and strength. Conclusion. The light after the seduction. The room is silent. Outside, the world hums along, oblivious to the invisible architectures of influence that shape thought, choice, and desire. But within, you have walked a path few dare to tread. You have peeked behind the curtain of charm, deception, and subtle manipulation. Yet here, in the quiet aftermath, there is clarity. Knowledge is illumination. Understanding the techniques of the seducer, both outside and within, renders their power imperfect, incomplete. What was once invisible is now exposed. What was once compelling becomes recognizable. The manipulation that once seemed subtle, even benevolent, is now mapped in your mind like a landscape of shadows you can navigate rather than stumble through. You have become a witness and a participant, conscious of the currents, capable of steering against them. Cults, media, relationships, workplaces, they all rely on the same principle. The human mind is malleable. And yet malleability is not weakness, it is adaptability. Awareness transforms vulnerability into strength. Every step you take toward reflection, every moment you pause to question, every choice you make deliberately is a reclaiming of autonomy. The seduction may be silent, but your consciousness is loud. It marks the boundary between influence and control, between reaction and intentionality. Consider the stories you have encountered in this book. Mara, Adam, Mariah, Sam. They were not born vulnerable, they were human. And in their recognition, you see your own potential. You see that recovery, autonomy, and resilience are possible. You understand that the seducer within, the subtle nudges outside, are not omnipotent. They are contingent on unexamined desire, unquestioned habits, and unrecognized patterns. Knowledge, reflection, and mindfulness dismantle these forces more effectively than anger or fear. But the conclusion is not a promise of simplicity. Awareness does not erase the world's manipulations. Subtlety will always exist. Influence will always linger. The true victory is the capacity to navigate these currents without surrendering your selfhood. It is the ability to witness the architecture of control without being consumed by it. Like a lighthouse standing against the storm, consciousness illuminates the path even as the waves crash around you. You have now seen the machinery of silent seduction in all its forms. Charm, mirroring, validation, love bombing, repetition, crisis, obligation, identity fusion. You have traced the psychological threads that connect these tactics and understood their application in everyday life. But above all, you have glimpsed a truth often obscured. The most profound seduction begins not with another person, but with unexamined desire, fear, or need. And the most potent antidote begins not with escape, but with self-awareness. So step forward with your mind, clear and your heart steady. Recognize the forces that seek to guide you, the patterns that whisper in your ear, and the internal seducer that seeks approval or fear. Observe them without surrender. Question without hesitation. Choose without compulsion. And in doing so, transform your life from a terrain of subtle control into a landscape of conscious choice, where autonomy, resilience, and authenticity reign. The shadow of influence will always exist, but you have learned to walk in the light. You carry knowledge like armor, insight like a lantern, and reflection like a compass. And as you move through the world, you are no longer simply a witness. You are a navigator, a sentinel, and ultimately a master of your own mind. The silent seduction has been revealed. The choice, as it always was, is yours. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who might find it helpful. Your support means everything and helps this channel grow and reach more people. And if you'd like to go even further in supporting the channel, consider joining as a member to get exclusive content and behind-the-scenes insights. Stay curious, stay powerful, and I'll see you in the next one.